My friends, have you ever felt the sting of betrayal? Have you ever been wounded by the very people you loved and trusted? Maybe you were lied to, abandoned, humiliated. Maybe someone you counted on turned their back on you, and in your darkest moments you asked God, why? But I'm here to tell you today, God wanted them to hurt you. Now, don't misunderstand me. God does not delight in suffering, but He allows it. Why? Because pain has a purpose. Because through every tear, every heartache, every broken dream, He is molding you, strengthening you, preparing you for something greater than you could ever imagine. Look at Joseph. His own brothers threw him into a pit, sold him into slavery, and left him for dead. But if they hadn't, he would have never reached the palace. If they had never betrayed him, he would have never become the second in command of Egypt, saving his family and an entire nation from famine. Listen to me, God's plan is bigger than your pain. Some of you today are still carrying the wounds of yesterday. You are still bleeding from words spoken in anger, from promises broken, from people who walked away. But I want you to hear this loud and clear. They didn't break you. They positioned you. You see, the enemy thought he had won when he hurt you. But what he didn't realize was that he was pushing you closer to your destiny. Jesus himself was betrayed. Judas sold him for 30 pieces of silver. The crowd shouted, "Crucify him." But that betrayal led him to the cross, and the cross led to the resurrection. And because he rose again, you and I have victory today. So, my friend, do not be discouraged by who left you, by who hurt you, by who tried to destroy you. They were just part of the process. Let go of the anger, release the pain, trust that God is turning it around for your good. Because what the enemy meant for evil, God will use for your greatest testimony. Amen. We live in a world that fears pain, that runs from it, that sees suffering as an enemy. But what if I told you that pain is not a curse but a tool? What if I told you that the very thing you are trying to escape is the very thing God is using to transform you? You see, pain is not a punishment. It is a divine instrument in the hands of a loving God. Many times when we go through trials, our first instinct is to cry out, "Why, Lord? Why me?" We assume that suffering means we've done something wrong, that we have fallen out of God's favor, or that He has turned His back on us. But that is not the nature of God. He does not abandon His children in suffering. He meets them there. He does not delight in our struggles, but He allows them because He sees the end from the beginning. He knows that what we are going through is not meant to break us, but to build us. Look at gold. In its raw form, it is mixed with impurities, with things that dull its shine. And so, to make it pure, it must go through fire. The heat burns away the impurities, leaving behind something radiant and valuable. And isn't that exactly what God does with us? He takes us through the fire, not to destroy us, but to refine us. He allows pain because there are things inside us that can only be removed through struggle. There are lessons we can only learn through trials. There are strengths we would never discover if life was always easy. Think about Job, a man of righteousness, a man who loved God, and yet he lost everything, his wealth, his health, his children. He suffered more than most of us could ever imagine. His friends told him to repent, assuming he must have sinned to deserve such hardship. His wife told him to curse God and die, but Job refused. He wrestled with his pain, he questioned, he wept, but he never let go of God. And in the end, God restored him, giving him twice as much as he had before. But more importantly, Job came out of that trial knowing God in a way he never had before. He said, "My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you." That's what suffering does. It deepens our relationship with God. It strips away the superficial. It brings us to our knees, and in that brokenness, we encounter Him in ways we never could in comfort. Some of the greatest people in Scripture, Moses, David, Paul, were not shaped in palaces of ease, but in deserts of struggle. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before he was ready to lead Israel. David was chased by Saul, hiding in caves before he ever sat on the throne. Paul was beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked. Yet he wrote, "I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us." They understood something that we must grasp today. God does not waste pain. Perhaps you are in a season of suffering right now. Perhaps you feel like the fire is too hot, the burden is too heavy, the storm is too fierce. You may feel like God has forgotten you, like he has turned away. But I want you to hear this today. He has not abandoned you. He is right there in the fire with you. And he is using this very moment to mold you, to strengthen you, to prepare you for something greater than you can see right now. The enemy wants you to believe that pain is a punishment, that it is evidence that God has forsaken you. But the truth is, if you are going through a trial, it means God is still at work in your life. It means he is preparing you for a new level. It means he sees something in you worth refining. Do not despise your suffering. Do not run from it. Lean into God. Seek him in the storm. Trust that he is working even when you don't understand, because one day you will look back and you will see that the very thing you thought would destroy you was the very thing God used to elevate you. Pain is not the end of your story. It is just the beginning of something greater. Trust the process. Trust the potter's hands, and know that on the other side of this pain is a testimony that will bring God glory. He said, betrayal is one of the deepest wounds a person can experience. It does not come from a stranger, from someone distant or indifferent. It comes from those closest to us. A friend, a loved one, someone we trusted. And when it happens, it shakes us to the core. We wonder, how could they do this to me? How could someone I cared for turn their back on me? The pain of betrayal is not just about what was done. It is about who did it. It feels personal. It feels final. But what if I told you today that betrayal is not the end of your story? What if I told you that the very thing meant to destroy you is what God will use to position you for your purpose? Look at the story of Joseph. Here was a young man with a dream. God had shown him visions of greatness, of leadership, of divine favor. But before the dream could be fulfilled, he had to walk through the valley of betrayal. His own brothers, the very people who should have protected him, sold him into slavery. They threw him into a pit, abandoned him, and left him for dead. Imagine the pain, the confusion, the heartbreak. Joseph had done nothing wrong, yet he suffered at the hands of those he loved. But what his brothers meant for evil, God turned for good. Because of that betrayal, Joseph was taken to Egypt. Because of that betrayal, he found himself in Pharaoh's palace. Because of that betrayal, he was placed in a position where he could save not only Egypt, but the very brothers who had betrayed him. If Joseph had never been sold, he would have never reached his destiny. If he had never been thrown into the pit, he would never sat on the throne. The betrayal was painful, but it was necessary for the fulfillment of his purpose. And isn't that the pattern we see throughout Scripture? David was betrayed by Saul, a man he had served faithfully. Jesus was betrayed by Judas, one of his own disciples. Paul was abandoned by those he trusted. Over and over again, the people God used mightily were first wounded deeply. Why? Because betrayal is not a detour. It is often the very road that leads to destiny. You may be in a season where someone you trusted has walked away. Maybe they spoke against you. Maybe they turned others against you. Maybe they cut you off and left you standing in the ruins of what you thought was a secure relationship. And in your pain, you are asking, why, God? But I want you to hear this. God is not surprised by their betrayal. He is not caught off guard. He is not wringing his hands in heaven wondering what to do now. No, he is using it. He is taking what was meant to harm you and turning it into something that will launch you forward. The betrayal was not meant to break you. It was meant to shift you. Jesus himself experienced the ultimate betrayal. Judas, a man who had walked with him, who had seen his miracles, who had heard his teachings, sold him for 30 pieces of silver. But without that betrayal, there would have been no cross. And without the cross, there would have been no resurrection. Judas thought he was ending Jesus' mission, but in reality, he was setting it in motion. And so it is with you. What was meant to destroy you is actually aligning you with your calling. The pain you are feeling now is not in vain. God sees it. He knows. And He is using it to push you into a new season, a greater level, a deeper purpose. So do not let the betrayal make you bitter. Do not let it harden your heart. Do not waste time seeking revenge or replaying the hurt over and over in your mind. Instead, lift your eyes to heaven and say, God, I trust you. I don't understand it, but I trust that you are working all things together for my good. Because one day you will look back and you will see that the betrayal did not end you, it positioned you. You will see that the pain was the very thing that led to your purpose. And when that day comes, you will stand in the place God has prepared for you, just like Joseph, and you will say with confidence, what they meant for evil, God has turned for good. Forgiveness is one of the hardest things God calls us to do. When we are wronged, when someone betrays us, when they hurt us deeply, everything in our human nature cries out for justice, for payback, for them to feel the same pain they inflicted on us. The world teaches us that holding on to anger, resentment, and bitterness gives us power. It tells us that forgiving someone is weakness, that it means letting them off the hook. But that is a lie. The truth is, forgiveness is not about setting them free. It is about setting yourself free. Unforgiveness is a prison. It keeps you locked in a cycle of pain, constantly reliving the hurt, carrying the weight of what was done to you. It steals your joy, poisons your heart, and affects every area of your life. You think you are punishing the one who hurt you, but in reality, you are punishing yourself. You are giving them continued power over your emotions, your thoughts, and your peace. That is why Jesus commanded us to forgive, not because the offender deserves it, but because we deserve to be free. Look at Jesus on the cross, betrayed by one of his own disciples, abandoned by his closest friends, mocked, beaten, and nailed to a tree. And yet in his final moments, he did not curse those who hurt him. He did not call down fire from heaven. No. He looked up and said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. The very people who drove the nails into his hands, he forgave. Why? Because he knew that forgiveness is the key to victory. He knew that bitterness is a trap of the enemy, that holding on to offense would do nothing but keep his heart bound. And that is the lesson for us today. Forgiveness does not mean pretending the pain didn't happen. It does not mean that what they did was right. It does not mean you have to trust them again or allow them back into your life. Forgiveness means releasing the offense to God. It means saying, Lord, I give this pain to you. I trust you to handle it. I will not let this bitterness take root in my heart. Think about Joseph. He had every reason to hate his brothers. They sold him into slavery. They stole years of his life. Yet when he finally had the power to punish them, he chose to forgive. He could have thrown them in prison. He could have repaid them for their evil. But instead, he embraced them and said, what you meant for evil, God has turned for good. That is the power of forgiveness. Maybe you've been betrayed. Maybe someone lied to you, abandoned you, hurt you in a way that changed your life forever. And maybe right now the idea of forgiving them feels impossible. But let me tell you this. God is not asking you to do it in your own strength. He knows it is hard. He knows it hurts. But He also knows that if you surrender it to Him, He will give you the grace to let it go. Forgiveness is not about feelings. If you wait until you feel like forgiving, you never will. Forgiveness is a choice. It is an act of obedience. It is saying, God, I don't want to carry this anymore. I choose to forgive even when I don't feel like it. And when you make that choice, when you release it into God's hands, that is when healing begins. That is when peace returns. That is when you walk in true victory. Jesus said, if you do not forgive others, your Father in heaven will not forgive you. That is how serious forgiveness is to God. We have been forgiven of so much. How can we withhold that same grace from others? No one has ever wronged us more than we have wronged God. Yet he wiped our slate clean. He poured out mercy we did not deserve. And now he asked us to do the same for others. So today I challenge you. Who do you need to forgive? What offense have you been carrying for too long? It is time to let it go. It is time to break free. The enemy wants to keep you trapped in bitterness, but God is calling you to something higher. Because forgiveness is not just an act of mercy, it is the ultimate victory. There are moments in life when pain feels unbearable, when the weight of disappointment, heartbreak, and suffering presses down on you so hard that you can barely breathe. You cry out to God asking, why? Why is this happening to me? Why do I have to go through this? You look at the shattered pieces of your life and it seems impossible to believe that anything good could ever come from this. But let me tell you something today. Your pain is not the end of your story. God's plan is greater than your pain. You see, we often measure life by what we can see in the moment. If things are going well, we assume God is with us. If things fall apart, we wonder if he has abandoned us. But God does not operate on our timeline or our understanding. His ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. He sees what we cannot see. He knows what we do not know. And sometimes he allows pain not to destroy us, but to position us for something greater. Look at the story of Job. Here was a man who had everything, a loving family, great wealth, and a strong faith in God. But in an instant, everything was taken from him. He lost his children. He lost his fortune. He lost his health. Even his friends turned against him. His own wife told him to curse God and die. And yet, in the midst of his suffering, Job refused to let go of God. He questioned. He wept. But he held on. And in the end, God restored him, not only giving him back everything he had lost, but blessing him with even more than before. Job's pain was great, but God's plan was greater. Maybe right now, you feel like Job. Maybe you are in a season of loss, of struggle, of unanswered prayers. Maybe you are wondering if God has forgotten you. But hear me today. God is not finished with your story. The pain you are feeling is not wasted. It's not meaningless. He is using it even if you cannot see it yet. Think about Joseph. He had dreams of greatness, of divine purpose, but before he could step into those dreams, he had to go through years of suffering. His own brothers betrayed him, throwing him into a pit and selling him into slavery. He was falsely accused and thrown into prison for a crime he did not commit. He spent years in darkness, wondering when or if God would deliver him. But what Joseph did not know was that his pain was preparing him for his purpose. If he had never been betrayed, he would have never ended up in Egypt. If he had never been imprisoned, he would have never met the man who would bring him before Pharaoh. And if he had never stood before Pharaoh, he would have never become the ruler of Egypt, saving an entire nation, including the very brothers who had betrayed him. Joseph later told his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. That is the power of God's plan. What the enemy meant to harm you, God will use for your good. The suffering you are enduring today is shaping you for the blessing that is coming tomorrow. Think about Jesus. He endured the ultimate pain, rejection, betrayal, torture, and death on a cross. His disciples thought it was over. The enemy thought he had won, but what they did not understand was that God's plan was still unfolding. 3 days later, Jesus rose from the grave, conquering sin and death forever. What looked like the greatest defeat became the greatest victory in history. That is what God does. He turns pain into purpose. He turns suffering into testimony. He takes what is broken and makes it whole again. So, my friend, do not give up. Do not let your pain convince you that God is done with you. What you're going through may not make sense right now, but trust that He is working behind the scenes. The doors that have closed, the people who have walked away, the battles you are fighting, none of it is wasted. God is using every tear, every hardship, every trial to prepare you for something greater than you can imagine. You may not understand it now, but one day you will look back and see that every moment of pain was part of a bigger plan. And on that day, you will stand in awe and say, God, I see it now. Your plan was greater than my pain all along. Through every trial, every betrayal, every heartbreak, and every painful moment, God has never abandoned you. What felt like punishment was really preparation. What seemed like an ending was actually the beginning of something greater. The pain you have endured was not without purpose. It was shaping you, refining you, and leading you into the destiny God has prepared for you. Yes, people may have hurt you. Yes, life may have knocked you down. But God never wastes pain. The very things that were meant to break you will be the very things that lift you. The betrayals will position you. The suffering will strengthen you. The tears you cried will become the testimony that sets others free. But the greatest victory comes when you choose forgiveness, when you choose to release the hurt, when you refuse to let bitterness take root in your heart, because forgiveness is not about them, it is about you. It is about walking in the freedom God has for you, unchained by the past, unburdened by resentment. So today, make the decision to trust Him. Trust that His plan is greater than your pain. Trust that what the enemy meant for evil, God is already turning for good. Trust that your suffering is not the end of your story. It is only a chapter, and the best is still to come. One day you will stand on the other side of this trial and see what God was doing all along. You will look back and realize that every moment of pain was leading you to something greater. And on that day you will lift your hands to heaven and say, Lord, I see it now. You were with me all along. Your plan was always greater than my pain.